You arrive filthy. That's not a metaphor. You are literally covered in mud, and possibly horse urine. It's hard to say which is which. The street you've just trudged through is more of a slurry channel than a road, a medieval masterpiece of uneven cobblestone, human waste, chicken feathers, and the smell of regret. You weren't planning to go to a tavern. But then again, no one in the 14th century plans to go anywhere. You move because you're cold, wet, hungry, or someone threw a bucket of something from an upstairs window. You move because the sun's gone down, the air's turned mean, and your boots, if they can still be called boots, have started leaking from places you didn't know existed. The sound of shouting grows louder, a good sign. If you can hear someone cursing about chickens, someone else singing badly, and a third person throwing up near a stable wall, you're close. Close to warmth, close to alcohol, close to the medieval version of civilization, which is a low bar, but still better than being outside. You round a corner and step directly into a puddle that is definitely more solid than liquid. Your foot makes a sound that suggests this was a mistake. But there it is, the tavern. It doesn't look like much. A crooked two-story building slouching between a tanner's hut and a blacksmith's forge. Smoke curls from a half-collapsed chimney. A wooden sign hangs by one hinge, swinging with the wind, and carved with an image that may be a beer barrel, or a sleeping pig, or both. You can't tell. That's fine. This is not the kind of place where the name matters. If it has a roof and doesn't charge you for entering, it's already better than most of your options. The front step is wet. Everything is wet. The door is warped, blackened at the edges, and opens with the reluctant groan of a dying animal. You step inside, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. A tavern has its own atmosphere, a unique blend of wood smoke, spilled ale, sweat, burnt onions, and that faint tang of mildew that clings to damp wool and worse decisions. You inhale it like a man who's just escaped, drowning only to land in a bathhouse full of cabbage. It's not pleasant, but it's warm, and it's not raining inside, which is the new standard of luxury. You close the door behind you, mostly to keep the cold out, partly to keep the goats from wandering in. They belong to someone, probably. The floor is dirt, not metaphorically, just dirt. Straw's been thrown down to make it look like someone tried. It hasn't helped. Your boots stick to the ground in a way that suggests someone spilled something thick and fermenting. You do not want to know what. Candles flicker in sconces nailed into cracked beams. The shadows move like they have opinions. The ceiling is low enough to endanger anyone over 5 feet tall. A man swears as he hits his head. Again, you ignore it. You find a bench, or at least something approximating one. It's a plank of wood across 2 barrels. One of them leaks. You sit anyway, because this is how it works. You arrive at the tavern because there is nowhere else. You stay because your legs stopped working somewhere around the 4th cart rut. And you survive because you understand that the tavern, for all its grime, is safer than the street, the field, or the forest. It is, somehow, a sanctuary. One with lice, yes, but sanctuary nonetheless. Around you, life happens. Loudly. A group of men argue about the price of salt. A woman tells a story about a goose that may or may not have committed a crime. Someone slams a mug on the table hard enough to make the candles shiver. You blink, adjust, try to appear as though you belong. Which you don't. Not yet. But that's all right. Belonging here isn't about status or manners or having clean shoes. It's about presence. You showed up. You didn't die on the road. You found the door. You walked in. That's enough. The tavern doesn't judge. It doesn't care. It barely notices. And in that indifference, there is comfort. You stop shivering. Slightly. Your hands are still cold, but your shoulders relax. You lean back against the wall, which feels vaguely sticky, but you don't move. You've given up on clean surfaces for the week. The tavern breathes. Not literally, though that wouldn't surprise you. It breathes through the sighs of the exhausted, the snores of the drunk, the crackle of the hearth that may or may not be cooking something edible. A dog limps past, dragging a half-eaten boot. It glares at you. You nod politely, You are not here to challenge anyone, least of all the dog. The tavern has a rhythm. You don't understand it yet, but it's there. The rise and fall of conversation, the creak of stools under too much weight, the muffled curse of someone realizing they've lost their purse or their patience. It's not organized, but it works. It has rules, unwritten, unspoken, and enforced by nothing more than custom and the occasional tankard to the face. You begin to learn them. Rule 1, mind your own business. Rule 2, don't insult the ale. Rule 3, don't sit where someone else might return. The last one is tricky, because ownership of seats is determined by a combination of heat signatures, spilled stew patterns, and vague territorial growling. You err on the side of caution and don't move. Someone brings food. Not to you, of course. To someone else. You smell it. Pottage. Probably. Something greyish-brown, with an alarming sheen and a vague smell of turnip. Your stomach growls. No one notices. That's fine. Hunger is the default state. You'll eat when the barmaid decides you exist, or when someone leaves something unattended. You glance around. The tavern is fuller now. More bodies, more noise, more heat. It's like being inside a loaf of bread that's halfway to burning. A man laughs so hard he falls off a bench. No one helps him. Another man starts singing about St. Crispin and a duck. It doesn't rhyme. It doesn't need to. You sit. You wait. You listen. You don't speak unless spoken to. This is not the place for introductions or small talk. This is the place where you disappear for a while, where the outside world doesn't reach, where news travels not through parchment, but through ale-soaked rumour, where someone's lost sheep becomes a saga, where a passing noble becomes a target, where a story, however ridiculous, becomes gospel if repeated enough times over enough drinks. This is the medieval tavern, a place of noise, nonsense, and necessity. You didn't plan to end up here. No one does. But now that you're here, now that the door has closed behind you and the cold stays outside, you understand. This is not just shelter. It's survival. It's the hearth at the edge of collapse. It's chaos contained in a wooden box. And tonight, it is home, for however long it lasts. The medieval tavern does not welcome you with charm. It does not open its arms like a cozy inn from a romantic tale, and it certainly does not smell like hospitality. It hits you immediately, a sensory assault so complete and unapologetic that you wonder briefly if you've walked into a mistake. But it is too late. You are already inside, and the door behind you has sealed with the dull thud of poor choices. The first thing you notice is the air, not the temperature, though it is warm, but the actual density. It clings to your skin like old soup. The tavern air is a stew of smoke, body heat, and unidentifiable fumes, lightly flavoured with despair. Above all, it is thick, not metaphorically, actually thick. If you breathe too quickly, you risk choking on particles of someone else's sweat, or the memory of burnt onions. And there will be onions. They are everywhere, burnt, boiled, or both, hanging from the rafters, stuffed into stew, rubbed into bread, perhaps even weaponized in arguments. The lighting is a conspiracy against your vision. Candles flicker unevenly from iron sconces and dripping chandeliers that resemble fire hazards more than functional fixtures. Shadows move like gossip, crawling across the walls in loops and jerks, distorting everything into vaguely sinister shapes. You blink. It doesn't help. The ceiling is low, built with the express intention of discouraging height and optimism. Support beams run at skull level, as evidenced by the collection of dents, curses, and dried blood decorating their undersides. The walls, if you can call them that, are a patchwork of timber, stone, and regret. Some are reinforced with fabric, usually burlap or tattered wool, nailed in place to block drafts or hide holes. Others bear the stains of years, candle soot, spilled ale, and something that might once have been stew. There is no such thing as clean in a medieval tavern, only degrees of filth, and the hope that what you're touching is dry. The floor is the most honest part of the tavern. It makes no effort to deceive. It is dirt, compressed by generations of boots, cloaks, and unconscious bodies. Straw has been thrown over it in what can only be described as a gesture, a failed attempt to absorb moisture, mask stains, or muffle the thuds of collapsing patrons. The straw is damp, dark, and possibly alive. You walk carefully, not out of respect, but survival. One wrong step, and your foot may sink into something with the texture of regret and the smell of livestock. The furniture, if we must call it that, appears to have been constructed by someone unfamiliar with basic geometry. Tables lean, wobble, and occasionally surrender. Benches groan like dying oxen. Nothing matches. One chair has 3 legs, another has 5. A crate serves as seating for 3 determined individuals. The arrangement of furniture suggests an earthquake in progress. There is no layout, just clusters of humans orbiting the hearth like moths with poor impulse control. And the hearth, the great center of warmth and chaos, is doing its best to function as a fireplace, a cooking station, and an open invitation to accidental immolation. Flames flicker dangerously close to someone's cloak. No one seems concerned. A pot bubbles on the edge, full of something thick, mysterious, and probably yesterday's leftovers reheated into a new identity. Above the hearth hangs a string of dried herbs, possibly for flavor, possibly for superstition, possibly just because someone thought it looked decorative. The smell of the tavern is a thing of legend, though not the kind you want retold. It begins with ale, always ale, spilled, stale, and soaked into every wooden surface. It hums in the air like a yeast-based fog. Then there's sweat, which isn't limited to armpits but radiates from every surface. Combined with smoke, it creates a kind of nasal fog that can be sliced, tasted, and regretted. Layered beneath that is meat, or rather, the echo of meat. Meat cooked, burned, dropped, stepped on, and possibly used in a minor altercation. There is also cheese, if you can call it that, and something vaguely aquatic lurking near the back wall. The scent is not consistent. It shifts with the breeze, with the opening of the door, with the movement of particularly fragrant patrons. And then there is the smell no one mentions, but everyone recognizes. A subtle undercurrent of humanity in its rawest form. The musk of bodies that have not seen water in weeks. The sharp note of chamber pots emptied too close to the establishment. The whisper of plague, or at least indigestion. You don't get used to it. You just grow numb. The soundscape is no more forgiving. Silence is not allowed here. It is feared, hunted, and destroyed. The tavern is a cacophony, a relentless orchestra of nonsense. Conversations overlap like tangled yarn. Laughter explodes without warning, usually followed by a crash or a scream. Someone sings in the corner, badly. Someone else tells a story no one listens to, except for the man pretending to fall asleep to avoid his turn. Plates clatter, mugs thump. A dog barks, a goat bleats. Why is there a goat? No one knows. It might be a regular. There are arguments happening in at least 3 languages, none of them coherent. Someone mentions taxes. Someone else starts quoting scripture in a tone that suggests creative interpretation. Someone else sneezes, prompting a chain reaction of dramatic flinching. There is no quiet corner, only degrees of shouting. Even when the volume dips for a moment, it never stays down. A lull is a threat. It's the sound of something about to break. And when it does, the noise returns double. Taverns are not built for peace. They are built for noise, heat, and fermentation. The crowd, if you study it long enough, becomes a living organism. It expands and contracts with spilled drinks and shifting tempers. It absorbs newcomers and spits out troublemakers. There is always someone telling a lie, always someone listening too closely, and always someone asleep with their head on the table and their hands still on their mug. No one has clean clothes. Everyone has secrets. This is not a place of comfort. It is a place of function, of escape, of gathering. You do not enter a medieval tavern to relax. You enter to survive one more night in a world that wants you dead by 50, and for that, it works. It gives you heat, food, drink, and the illusion that your problems are outside the door. At least until someone opens it and lets them back in. You look around, at the grime, at the flickering light, at the man who just fell over without spilling his drink, and you understand, this is not the worst place you've ever been. It's simply the most honest. A room without silence, without privacy, without hygiene, but also without judgment. The medieval tavern is a room built out of noise, shadow, sweat, and hope. And somehow, it holds together, just barely, like the people inside it. The medieval tavern is not chaos. It only looks like it. At first glance, what you see is a room full of noise, smoke, spilled stew, and a man arguing with a dog about table rights. It seems lawless, disordered, as if at any moment the roof might cave in just to escape the company. But if you sit long enough, you'll begin to see the pattern, not order in the civilized sense, not the kind of structure that comes with laws or ledgers, but an ecosystem, unspoken, unsupervised, and yet surprisingly stable, like a swamp or a fire. At the heart of this ecosystem is a hierarchy no one discusses but everyone obeys. It's not about wealth or birth. A noble in a tavern gets no special seat unless they brought armed friends. It's about familiarity, function, and force of personality. Regulars sit near the hearth, not because they pay extra, but because they've earned their spots through 1,000 evenings of shouting, drinking, and helping the tavern keeper drag unconscious men outside. These are the warm-blooded furniture of the establishment. They know which stools creak, which barrels leak, and which corners should be avoided after sunset. You are not one of them. Not yet. Until then, you hover at the edges, on benches that tilt, or crates that smell faintly of fish. Your job is to observe and survive. At the top of the tavern food chain is the tavern keeper. They are not just a bartender. They are monarch, judge, surgeon, and executioner. They run the room with a glance, a grunt, or in more serious cases, a ladle to the forehead. If you speak out of turn, complain about the ale, or suggest that the stew had too much bark in it, they will remind you, publicly and without mercy, that this is not a democracy. They are the law, the menu, and the last line of defense between semi-functional community and full-scale riot. No one challenges them twice. Under the tavern keeper's gaze, the regulars enforce the next layer of authority. These are the familiar faces, the men who never seem to leave, the women who know which patrons are likely to pay, and which ones will try to barter with buttons. They carry information. Who's new? Who's trouble? Who's too drunk to notice missing coins? If someone breaks a rule, they don't get lectured. They get stared at until they leave or adapt. This is peer pressure in its most ancient form. Then there are the service staff, if the tavern is fortunate enough to have them. A barmaid with the strength of a blacksmith and the hearing of a spy. A boy too young to be there but somehow carrying 3 mugs and a goat in the same trip. A girl with one eye and a knife strapped to her boot who smiles only when someone falls. They move through the room with the efficiency of experience and the scars to match. You do not block their path. You do not touch them. If they like you, they might warn you about the stew. If they don't, you'll find out the hard way. Newcomers fall into 2 categories: those who adapt and those who get kicked. Adaptation means understanding the system quickly. Don't sit in a claimed seat. Don't talk louder than the room unless you're prepared to be proven wrong with a tankard to the temple. Don't flirt with someone who has already broken a chair over a previous flirtation. Learn to nod more than speak. Learn to listen before you drink. The ones who don't adapt become lessons. The tavern is not kind to slow learners. Somewhere near the hearth, a group of men gamble. They've been gambling since you arrived, possibly since last week. They use dice carved from bones and coins bent from heat. The stakes vary: copper, bread, promises, but the consequences are constant. The winner stays. The loser leaves. If not physically, then socially. To lose too often is to become invisible, a background character whose opinions no longer matter. Above the gamblers, or near them, is the storyteller. Not always a bard, sometimes just a drunk with confidence. But in the tavern, storytelling is currency. You tell a good tale, and the room feeds you. You tell a bad one, and someone throws bread at your face. Or worse, silence follows. In a tavern, silence is the ultimate rejection. The listeners are the bulk of the room, the ambient humanity. Farmers, laborers, travelers, thieves pretending to be pilgrims, and pilgrims who've become thieves. They grunt in response to jokes. They shout when insulted. They eat with their hands and drink with abandon. They are the sea, sometimes calm, sometimes crashing into each other in a frothy brawl over a chicken. And like the sea, they do not remember what happened yesterday. Only who is still standing. Children move like ghosts. You never see them arrive, but there they are, under tables, near the fire, darting between legs to snatch fallen coins, or the last crust of bread. No one tells them to leave. No one invites them either. They are part of the tavern's immune system. Quick, silent, adaptive. Old men sit at the back, watching, not because they are wise, but because they are tired. They've seen this all before. The fights, the flirting, the stew that bites back. They speak only when someone younger makes a mistake they once made. And when they do speak, the room listens, briefly, then returns to noise. The animals, because yes, there are always animals, form their own microstructure. The dog near the hearth has seniority. He gets scraps and growls at anyone who tries to take them. The goat, tied to a leg of the bench, chews on whatever isn't moving. Chickens occasionally enter, never at the same time, never with explanation. You learn not to step on them. The rules of the tavern are simple. Don't bleed on the floor, unless you plan to mop it. Don't start a fight, unless you know you'll finish it. Don't sing unless someone asks you to. And above all, don't ask what's in the stew. The stew has no fixed recipe, no consistent texture, and no accountability. It simply exists. Like the tavern, you finish your drink. It tastes like smoke and survival. Around you, the ecosystem shifts. Someone arrives, someone leaves. A man slumps onto a table. A woman stands with the confidence of someone who's won a fight recently. The goat sneezes. The system absorbs it all. No one comments, no one controls it, and yet it functions. The medieval tavern is not chaos. It is a living, breathing organism, held together by shared necessity and mutual delusion. You are not its master. You are not even important. You are a cell in a drunken beast that doesn't know it's alive, but you're inside it, which means, for now, you belong. The tavern keeper is not your friend. They are not here to make you feel welcome, ask about your day, or remember your favorite drink. They are not invested in your emotional arc, your tragic backstory, or your quest for personal growth. They are here to keep the tavern from burning down, both figuratively and occasionally literally. They are the central nervous system of the medieval tavern, the one person standing between mild social disorder and full-scale bloodshed. Without them, the place would collapse into noise and fire within 20 minutes. With them, it just runs slightly above chaos, like a drunken beehive with stools. The tavern keeper wears many hats. Not actual hats. Those would be a safety hazard around open flame, but metaphorical ones. They are the chef, the bartender, the accountant, the bouncer, the gossip archivist, and the arbiter of arguments about chickens, debts, or who stole whose mug. They hold no title recognized by the crown, but their authority is absolute within these walls. Even the local reeve thinks twice before crossing them. You may call them innkeeper, barkeep, or just oi, but never forget, they are in charge and they know it. Physically, the tavern keeper is not someone you describe as gentle. If male, he is built like a bread oven, wide, hot, and vaguely dangerous. His arms look like he could knead dough or kneecaps with equal ease. His face carries the permanent scowl of someone who has had to clean up other people's vomit too many times and has developed a deep, unshakable pessimism about human potential. If female, She is sharper than the knives she doesn't let anyone else touch. Her stare has silenced drunks mid-belch. She has stopped bar fights with a single raised eyebrow. And her apron could tell stories that would make a monk renounce literacy. Regardless of gender, the tavern keeper is carved from a mixture of old gristle, hot stew, and the kind of quiet rage only sustained customer service can produce. They know who's in the tavern. They know who was here last night. They know who left without paying 2 weeks ago and now walks with a limp. They keep track of debts with terrifying accuracy, all without writing anything down. Medieval literacy was rare. Tavern memory was not. If you owe them money, they will know. If you lied about your identity, they already heard it from someone who heard it, from someone who's sleeping with your cousin. If you're trying to stay out of sight, good luck. Nothing stays hidden in a room full of alcohol and desperation. The tavern keeper is the thermostat of the room. When they're in a good mood, things hum along. The drinks flow, the stew is edible, and even the dog seems friendlier. When they're in a bad mood, the air turns sharp. Conversation drops an octave. Patrons drink faster, and everyone pretends to laugh a little louder, just in case. The tavern keeper can eject you without touching you. All it takes is a look, a pause in their motion, a slight shift in tone, and suddenly, everyone remembers that you don't belong. It is a social exile so complete, you'll find yourself drinking alone, even if someone is physically beside you. When things go wrong, and they always go wrong, the tavern keeper becomes the first responder. Bar fight? They're the ones swinging the ladle and yelling louder than the combatants. Fire in the hearth? They smother it with last night's stew, or the coat of the drunk who started it. Somebody collapses? They decide whether to roll them to the side, drag them out, or let the dog sort it out. Their job is not to create peace. It is to manage entropy, and they are very, very good at it. The tavern keeper also serves as the unofficial intelligence agency of the town. Need to know who's cheating on whom? Ask them. Want to know who's running from debt, dodging taxes, or praying too loudly in the wrong church? They know. They are the hub where information gathers, is strained through ale, and comes out as a dangerous mix of fact, rumor, and weaponized small talk. If you need information, you don't buy a scroll. You buy the barkeep a drink. If you need protection, you sit where they can see you. If you need forgiveness, you'd better hope your offense wasn't memorable, because the tavern keeper doesn't forget the good stuff. They only forget faces, never debts or insults. Occasionally, the tavern keeper has help, a spouse who looks equally disappointed in the world, a son carrying jugs too heavy for his age, a daughter with a scar and no patience, or a foundling orphan who was too stubborn to die and now runs drinks faster than most adults. These assistants learn the trade the hard way, dodging elbows, mopping vomit, and learning the ancient art of ducking when someone yells. They are not protected from the tavern's moods. They are tempered by them. It is unclear if they are employees, apprentices, or simply permanent residents who never found the door. The kitchen, such as it is the tavern keeper's domain. It is usually just a corner with a pot, a knife, and a collection of ingredients best not discussed. They don't follow recipes. They follow instinct, memory, and the availability of root vegetables. They do not explain what's in the stew. They do not apologize for it. You're lucky there's food. If it's warm, chewable, and doesn't bite back, that's a win. Complaints are met with silence. Persistent complaints are met with something much louder. There are no menus. There are no specials. There is just what's left, and how angry the tavern keeper was when cooking it. If you ask what something is, they will tell you to eat it or leave. Sometimes both. And yet, despite all this despite the smoke, the smell, the shouting, and the occasional bleeding, the tavern functions. Because the tavern keeper makes it function. Not through charm, not through service, but through presence, through sheer gravitational authority. They hold the room together by force of habit and the unspoken fear that if they ever left, the whole place would collapse into ash and memory. Patrons respect them, or at least pretend to. which is the closest thing to respect anyone has in this place. The drunkest man in the room still knows better than to spill his mug too close to the bar. The loudest argument dies out when the tavern keeper stands, and even the thief who swore he'd never return will leave coins on the counter, quietly, before disappearing again. Because you don't cross the king in the apron. You don't fight the one person keeping the roof from caving in. You just say thank you with your eyes, drink your ale, and pray you're not the reason they pick up the ladle. In the Middle Ages, people drank because they were thirsty, but also because they were alive, and that alone required sedation. Water, despite being the most abundant beverage in theory, was considered a suspicious liquid, best avoided, unless recently boiled, recently blessed, or recently frozen. Streams were open sewers, wells were dice rolls, and rain barrels were biodiversity experiments. So they drank alcohol, not to get drunk, though that often happened, but because fermented liquid was safer than the natural alternative. Congratulations. Your survival strategy is beer. The most common drink was ale, not the kind you sip from a tulip glass while arguing about hops, but the kind brewed in someone's basement with whatever grain, yeast, or vaguely organic matter they could find. Medieval ale was flat, warm, cloudy, and brownish if you were lucky. It didn't keep well, which was fine because it was usually gone within hours. It came in 3 categories: weak, strong, and you'll forget your name by morning. The weak ale was for breakfast. Yes, breakfast. Because nothing starts your day like a lukewarm pint of slightly fermented barley sludge. It had low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria and your appetite. Children drank it. So did monks. So did anyone who didn't want to start the morning with cholera. It was called small beer, and it was about as exciting as drinking wet bread. But it kept you alive, and in the Middle Ages, that was a high bar. The strong ale was for the evening, for feasts, for funerals, and for forgetting. It had more punch, more flavour, and more risk. It was stored in barrels that leaked, served in mugs that cracked, and measured in units best described as guess. Recipes varied wildly. Some used honey, some used herbs, some used things best left unnamed. Drinking was not just a necessity, it was a routine. You drank with every meal, sometimes during meals, sometimes instead of meals. It lubricated social interaction and soothed the reality of medieval life, which was mostly mud, taxes, and toothaches. Ale was cheap, easy to make, and occasionally explosive. Brewing was done at home, at monasteries, and at taverns. Sometimes it was sold legally. Sometimes it was sold by people who measured quality by how many people still stood after 2 pints. Every village had at least one alewife, a woman who brewed and sold ale from her home, her yard, or her suspiciously tilted cart. She was a vital part of the community, respected and feared, and sometimes accused of witchcraft because no one believed you could brew something that strong without a deal with the devil. Cider was the countryside alternative, made from apples when the harvest was good, and from regrets when it wasn't. It was sweeter, lighter, and slightly more polite, but it still got the job done. Then there was mead. Mead was honey wine, the drink of warriors and poets, or at least that's what they told themselves. In reality, it was sticky, slow to make, and usually reserved for special occasions, like weddings, raids, or celebrating that the local lord had died and left behind no heirs. Mead had the reputation of being noble, ancient, and romantic. It also gave you a headache that made you question your ancestry. And then there was wine. If you lived in southern Europe, wine was everywhere. If you lived in northern Europe, wine was for clergy, merchants, and people who liked to pretend they had taste. Most medieval wine was sour, thin, and cut with water, spices, or occasionally vinegar. It was stored in wooden barrels and ceramic jugs, which meant it absorbed the flavor of whatever was stored there last, including fish sauce. Only the wealthy had access to good wine, and even they often drank it out of habit rather than pleasure. In taverns, drinks were not listed on a menu. You drank what was available. You didn't ask for a vintage. You didn't request a tasting flight. You pointed at a mug and hoped it didn't fight back. And yet, despite all this, people drank with enthusiasm. Because alcohol wasn't about taste. It was about escape. It was about numbing the cold, the aches, the fear that came with living in a world where wolves, plagues, and landlords could ruin your week. It was a form of medicine, a tool of the divine, a social adhesive, and sometimes a very slow-acting poison. Drinking had rules. You didn't drink from someone else's mug, unless invited. You didn't toast without eye contact, unless you wanted bad luck. You didn't spill unless you wanted a brawl. And if you did brawl, you bought the next round. That was the code. That was civilization. The tavern was the cathedral of consumption. Here, drinks flowed like sermons, loud, frequent, and only occasionally misunderstood. A man could lose his coin, his horse, his virtue, and still be welcome back if he paid his tab. But if he wasted ale, if he insulted the brew, if he questioned the strength of the house barrel, then he was finished. That was sacrilege. Even the dog would judge him. Drink was how deals were made, alliances forged, and betrayals softened. It was the oil in the medieval social machine. Without it, the parts scraped too loudly. With too much of it, they exploded. Balance was rare. Drunkenness came in many forms. The quiet leaner, the loud philosopher, the crying widowmaker, the man who tried to sing about love and ended up howling like a goat. And all of them were part of the ecosystem. Sobriety was not a virtue. It was a burden. The sober one was the designated witness, the one who would remember everything, and therefore someone to avoid. Better to blur the lines, soften the facts, and let the next morning bring forgiveness. Or at least confusion. Drinking in the Middle Ages was not glamorous. It was not refined. It was barely consistent. But it was vital. It was survival in a tankard. Liquid courage. Yes. But also liquid sanity, liquid forgetfulness, and occasionally liquid mistake. You didn't drink to be merry. You drank because there was nothing else to do, and no good reason not to. And somehow, despite the flavor, the aftertaste, and the consequences, it worked. You raised your mug, you took a swig, and for a moment, you felt like the world made sense. Then the goat bit your leg, and you spilled it all. But that's tomorrow's problem. Today, you drink. There is no menu. Let's begin there. A medieval tavern does not offer you a printed selection of artisanal options written in flowing calligraphy and paired with clever puns. There is no chalkboard with the day's specials. There is no waiter who smiles like they enjoy existing. There is just the stew. There is always stew. You do not ask what kind. You do not ask what's in it. You simply accept that it exists, that it is hot, and that it will fill the empty space inside you with something vaguely edible and questionably alive. The stew is not one dish. It is an ongoing entity, a continuous culinary experiment that began sometime last week, or possibly last month, and has never fully ended. Ingredients are added when available, and rarely removed. If it bubbles, it's ready. If it hisses, you wait. If it bites back, you call for the tavern keeper and apologize for insulting the pot. The color is usually brown, not a rich, warm brown, more like mud that once knew hope, brown. The texture is best described as inconsistent, part broth, part sludge, part surprise. You may encounter a recognizable vegetable. You may also encounter something that twitches. Some days there's meat, some days there's regret. It depends on what wandered too close to the hearth, what was left from yesterday, or what the tavern keeper found under a bench and decided not to waste. Bread accompanies the stew, in the same way a brick might accompany your fall from a tower. It is dense, stale, and potentially lethal. This is not the soft, crusty bread of artisan bakeries. This is bread that challenges you, bread that tests your teeth, your patience, and your will to chew. If it's warm, be suspicious. That usually means it's been reheated from the inside of someone's cloak. Most of the time it serves as a utensil. You dip it in the stew. You wipe your bowl with it. You throw it at rats. You do not, under any circumstance, expect it to taste good. Taste is not the point. Survival is. Some bread is made with rye, some with barley, some with things that were technically once grain, but now mostly resemble gravel. If you are lucky, the bread is free of visible mold. If you are less lucky, you scrape off the green parts and call it seasoning. If you are truly unlucky, you hallucinate and wake up married to a barmaid named Agatha, who insists you promise to build her a chicken coop. Protein exists in the menu in the same way stars exist during the day. Technically, it's there, but don't expect to see much of it. Meat, if it appears, is usually in pieces too small to identify. It might be pork, it might be rabbit, it might be pigeon. It might be something that fell in the stew by accident. Nobody asks, because nobody wants to know. The stew is democratic. All ingredients are equal once submerged. On rare days, there is cheese. Medieval cheese is not a luxury. It is a consequence. It is aged not for flavor, but because refrigeration doesn't exist and someone forgot about the milk. It's hard, pungent, and stored in a cloth that has not been washed since the last plague. It crumbles when it's supposed to slice. It oozes when it's supposed to crumble. You eat it because it exists, not because it deserves to. Occasionally, the tavern offers pies. Do not be misled. These are not pies in the modern sense. There is no flaky crust, no lovingly seasoned filling, no sweet surprise beneath a golden dome. Medieval pies are protective devices. The crust is designed not to be eaten, but to keep the contents from escaping. You break the top with your knife and pray that nothing screams. Inside, you may find turnips, onions, dried peas, or something claiming to be eel. Again, you do not question. You chew, you swallow, you hope. Vegetables are rare. When they appear, they arrive boiled to the point of surrender. They are no longer crisp, bright, or distinguishable. Cabbage becomes paste. Leeks become threads. Carrots disintegrate on contact with a spoon. If you see color in your food, it's probably a warning. Herbs exist only if someone walked past a monastery recently. Salt is a luxury. Pepper is a rumor. And anything resembling spice is either medicinal or a mistake. Most tavern meals are unseasoned, except by accident. If the stew tastes different today, it means someone new fell into the pot. For dessert, there is ale, or nothing. Sugar is expensive. Honey is rare. If you ask for cake, you will be laughed at until someone throws bread at you. The closest thing to sweetness is a dried fig that's been rehydrated in lukewarm wine and buried under a layer of crushed regret. There is no garnish, there are no sides. The concept of plating is unknown. Food is served in wooden bowls, pewter dishes, or whatever survived the last tavern brawl. You eat with your hands, with a knife, or with whatever the dog didn't steal first. Napkins are theoretical. Table manners are optional. If you don't finish your food, someone else will. If you don't protect your food, it will walk away, either via child, animal, or air current. Despite all of this, you eat. You eat because your stomach doesn't care about presentation. Because hunger makes you generous with your standards. Because somehow, this mess of stew, bread, and vague nutrition keeps people alive long enough to complain about it. The medieval tavern menu is not about flavor. It is not about joy. It is about function. It fills the gap. It silences the growl. It gives you something to chew while pretending you're not chewing on existential dread. And sometimes, just sometimes, it doesn't kill you, which, by medieval standards, makes it a good meal. The medieval tavern was never just a place to eat, drink, or recover from your third bad decision of the day. It was something far more dangerous. A place to watch, be watched, and accidentally learn everything about everyone whether you wanted to or not. It was the original social media platform, minus the screens and plus the body odor. There were no usernames. You had your face, your voice, and the unfortunate tunic you spilled stew on last week. There were no privacy settings. If you were within earshot, You were part of the conversation. And by earshot, we mean the entire tavern, because medieval insulation was a joke, and everyone shouted like the building was on fire, which, occasionally, it was. In a world without phones, books, or the concept of alone time, people watching was not a hobby. It was a survival skill. You learned who owed whom, who limped for legitimate reasons, and who was faking it for sympathy, who was sleeping with the baker's wife, who was pretending not to sleep with the blacksmith's husband. You read the room the way modern people scroll a feed, endlessly, aimlessly, and with a mix of horror and fascination. You could tell someone's mood by how hard they chewed their bread. You could predict a fight by the angle at which a man set down his mug. You watched because there was nothing else to do. You watched because everyone else was watching you. Everyone was their own source of content. Stories were shared, not because they were true, but because they were interesting. There was no fact-checking, no moderation. Just one man claiming he'd fought a bear, and another asking how tall the bear was while stealing his stew. Lies travelled faster than logic. A man might leave a tavern with a limp, and return 3 days later with a reputation as a war hero, a wizard, or the illegitimate son of a duke. And if enough people repeated the story, it became true. The medieval tavern ran on narrative. Oversharing was not a glitch. It was the system. People spilled their guts faster than the stew pot, sometimes out of drunkenness, sometimes out of loneliness, sometimes because they genuinely believed the man sitting next to them, who hadn't blinked in 10 minutes, was a priest in disguise and would absolve them for the price of a drink. Secrets did not survive long. If you told one, it was already public before you finished the sentence. Whispered down the bench, shouted over the stew pot, misheard, mistranslated, and turned into a local legend by midnight. The woman crying in the corner? Her husband ran off with a nun, a goat, or both. The man with a black eye? Lost a bet, or a duel, or a staring contest with the tavern keeper. The boy selling firewood? Illegitimate son of the reeve, or so the woman 3 tables over says, and she's never wrong. Reputation wasn't managed. It happened to you. And once it stuck, it rarely changed. If you vomited on the hearth one time, you were that guy forever. If you flirted with the barmaid and she laughed, you were either a legend or a cautionary tale. There was no delete button, no way to clarify, only time, and even that couldn't erase everything. Taverns were also where news happened. Not official news, but real news. Who died? Who fled? Who got caught stealing onions and had to walk through the village wearing nothing but shame and a badly written confession sign? Local politics were debated here, loudly and inaccurately. Taxes were cursed. Lords were insulted. The bishop's gout was mocked. Sometimes a traveller would bring rumours from other towns. War on the coast. Famine in the north. A woman in the next village gave birth to twins with different fathers. Probably not true, but definitely repeated. And before you know it, it's a prophecy. Everyone talked. No one listened. And yet somehow, the tavern remembered everything. It was a living archive, held together by stubborn memory, ale fumes, and the loud insistence that no, you did say that, and everyone here heard you. There were influencers. They just didn't call them that. They were the loud ones, the funny ones, the dangerous ones. The man who told the best stories. The woman who could curse in 5 languages and still get a discount on her drink. The one with a scar and a theory about ghosts. These people shaped opinions, gathered followers, started trends like, wear your knife on the left now because the right is cursed. You could rise in tavern society with a good joke, a bold claim, or an especially theatrical fight. You could fall just as quickly by boring people, getting caught cheating at dice, or asking too many questions. Taverns were democratic in the cruelest way. Everyone had a voice, but some voices were louder, meaner, and backed up with more scars. Silence was suspicious. If you didn't talk, people assumed you were hiding something, planning something, or worse, judging them. Better to say something, anything, even if it was ridiculous. At least then, you were part of the noise. Listening was dangerous too. If you stared too long at the wrong person, they assumed you were eavesdropping, or worse, interested. If you listened too closely to a confession, you became part of it. Suddenly you're someone's alibi, whether you agreed to it or not. In the tavern, attention was currency. Laughter was applause. Gasping was engagement. A well-timed insult could make you a star. A poorly timed silence could get you stabbed. It was a performance space with stew. And like all performance spaces, it fed on chaos, ego, and a desperate need to be seen. In a world without letters, mirrors, or privacy, the tavern gave people what they craved: recognition. You existed because someone else saw you, remembered you, and told a story about you, true or not. That was fame. That was infamy. That was immortality. Tavern style. You didn't need a profile picture. You had scars. You didn't need a comment section. You had the man next to you, yelling that your theory about dragons was idiotic. And if you wanted to disappear, you couldn't. Because someone, somewhere, remembered you trying to sing last week, and they're not letting that go. Ever. The first thing you notice isn't the smell, though it is unforgettable. It's the sound. The medieval tavern does not greet you with silence. It assaults you with noise. Constant, overlapping, unapologetic noise. This is not background ambience. This is full contact acoustic warfare. It is not something you listen to. It is something you survive. Walk through the crooked wooden door, and you're instantly submerged in the sonic swamp. Mugs slam against tables, uneven floorboards creak under the weight of someone's fourth bad idea, and chairs scrape the floor like rusty swords dragged across a battlefield. A dog barks. A man sneezes into his stew. Somewhere, someone laughs like they've just murdered an accountant. None of it is in rhythm. All of it is loud. Conversations are less about communication and more about territorial dominance. No one speaks at a normal volume. They shout, not because they're angry, though many are, but because volume is the only way to participate. If you speak softly, you disappear. If you pause, someone louder takes your place. There is no listening, only waiting for your turn to shout, and sometimes not even that. Background noise is constant. Coins clinking in a hand that doesn't intend to spend them. The clatter of dice as 3 games and 5 arguments erupt over the same table. The suspicious gurgle of stew being stirred in a pot that may contain at least 1 boot. Then there's the coughing. Not polite, handkerchiefed coughing. Violent, lung-dismantling explosions of phlegm that double as punctuation. The tavern's unofficial rhythm section. Every cough is a drumbeat of doom. Every sneeze is a cymbal crash of regret. The fire cracks. The goat bleats. The child under the bench drops a wooden spoon for the 6th time. You begin to realize there is no silence. Not even a moment. Even the pauses are filled with the sigh of the wind through the badly patched windows, or the desperate whisper of someone trying to sell counterfeit cheese. And then, if you're lucky, or unlucky.com, is the music. Not the kind that soothes, the kind that survives. Someone pulls out a fiddle that has survived 3 owners and at least 1 fire. It's missing a string. Doesn't matter. Someone else bangs on a drum that used to be a pot lid. Another joins with a pipe carved from something that might have been legal once. The melody is not agreed upon. It simply happens. Or it doesn't. Sometimes the music is just the rhythmic thump of a drunk falling over repeatedly in the same spot. There's often singing, sometimes from a bard. More often from the loudest drunk who knows the first 2 lines of a song and then mumbles the rest until they remember the chorus. Then they sing the chorus again and again, until the room either joins in or tells them to shut up. Sometimes both. Lyrics are improvised, frequently offensive, and occasionally profound in ways no one intended. One verse about a woman's goat might accidentally become a metaphor for mortality, or a lawsuit. You never know. The barmaid yells for more mugs. The tavern keeper yells for less bleeding. The fire hisses like it's trying to escape. A table collapses. No one stops talking. This is the music of mayhem. No conductor. No key. Just the collective expression of exhaustion, alcohol, and deeply suppressed feelings about taxes. Even arguments have their own soundtrack. A rising tempo of accusation, a crescendo of shouted names, and then, if things escalate, a percussive solo involving fists and regret. Chairs squeal across the floor like tortured hogs. A tankard flies. A dog barks again, this time in solidarity. The fight ends, or pauses, or merges into a new conversation about pigs. You can't tell. You're still listening to the man beside you explain for the third time how he nearly married a duchess, if not for the weather. He says this louder each time. You nod, because arguing would require shouting louder, and you value your ears. This place is not loud by accident. It is loud by necessity. In a world without microphones, amplification means repetition. If a story matters, it must be told 5 times at 5 different tables. If a rumor is important, it must be shouted over soup. If you want to be remembered, you don't write. You perform. The tavern is where you announce your presence to the world, whether the world asked for it or not. And it responds with equal volume. You can try to find a quiet corner, but the quiet will follow you. Someone will cough. Someone will knock over a bench. Someone will ask if you're hiding from your wife. You're not allowed to withdraw. The tavern pulls you in. It demands your noise. Even animals contribute. The goat bleats with the rhythm of someone mocking a bard. Chickens cluck like critics. The dog groans audibly every time someone tries to sing, and the occasional rat adds a wet squeak of commentary from behind the barrels. You think you'll get used to it. You won't, but your ears will adapt. They'll learn to filter the violence from the flirtation, the laughter from the warning, the shout that means, "Come here," from the one that means, "Duck." It's a skill, like lip reading, but louder and worse. This soundscape is not just noise. It is the heartbeat of the tavern. It is how the building breathes. If it were ever silent, truly silent, you would panic, because that would mean something terrible has happened, or is about to. As long as the room is loud, the world is normal, brutal, chaotic, incomprehensible, but normal. So you sit. You listen. You pretend you understand the lyrics. You nod to the beat of a spoon against a mug. You raise your voice just enough to be heard, not enough to challenge the hierarchy. And somewhere, beneath the shouting and the sneezing and the spontaneous accordion duel, you realize this is music. Not good music. Not music you'd want to remember, but music nonetheless. The music of mayhem. The music of life. Poorly tuned and far too loud. "Let the games begin" is not a triumphant phrase in the medieval tavern. It is a warning, a quiet sigh from the tavern keeper, a dog slinking under a bench, a barmaid already clearing the sharp objects off the nearest table. Games in a medieval tavern are not recreational. They are rituals of loss, desperation, and poorly disguised aggression. They exist to pass the time until violence, stew, or sleep arrives, whichever comes first. Gambling, of course, is the preferred method of financial destruction. It requires minimal equipment and absolutely no self-control. Dice are the standard tool, small, square, and usually carved from bone, wood, or a suspiciously smooth chunk of animal tooth. They are rarely symmetrical, never trusted, and always blamed. No one ever loses because of chance. They lose because the dice were cursed, the table was slanted, or someone across the room sneezed at the wrong moment. Medieval dice games go by many names, most of them untranslatable and shouted through ale breath. The rules are flexible. The goal is usually to guess the outcome of a roll, pretend you didn't cheat, and accuse someone else of cheating louder than they accuse you. Stakes vary. Coins, buttons, promises, goats, or, on very bad days, favors that will come back to haunt you 3 villages later. Sometimes the wager is a drink. Sometimes it's your dignity. Sometimes it's both. The smart ones stop after 1 round. The others keep going until they're broke, unconscious, or suddenly without eyebrows due to a side bet that seemed funny at the time. The atmosphere around gambling tables is a strange cocktail of hope, paranoia, and light bruising. Everyone thinks they're clever. Everyone is watching everyone else. The moment someone wins twice in a row, the suspicion begins. Are they blessed? Are they cursed? Did they switch the dice while you blinked? Did the tavern dog signal the numbers with his tail? Trust collapses faster than a chair under a fat night. Cards, when available, are worse. A full deck is rare. Rules are regional. Cheating is expected. And since literacy is optional, most players make up both the game and the logic. The game is not really about winning. It is about surviving the accusation of winning too well. Victory paints a target on your back. Modest losses are respected. Dramatic wins are dangerous. The most valuable skill is not card counting. It's face control. Lose with grace. Win with guilt. And always pretend you don't understand how you won. That's safety. That's strategy. And if that fails, run. Then there are the games of shame. Less about money, more about humiliation. These games involve strength, endurance, or stupidity. Often all three. Arm wrestling is popular. Not because it's fair, but because it's fast. Two men lock hands across a sticky table and attempt to break each other's wrists in front of a screaming audience. The winner gains momentary glory. The loser gains a limp and a nickname. Then there's knife throwing, which is rarely about hitting the target and mostly about proving your hand doesn't shake too much. If someone loses a toe, the crowd cheers. If someone hits the bullseye, the crowd suspects witchcraft. Nobody wins. Everybody claps. There's a game where you stare at a candle without blinking, another where you hold your breath while submerged in a bucket of ale, another where you balance a spoon on your nose until someone punches you. Rules are not standardized. Outcomes are rarely rewarding. Then come the challenges disguised as games. Climb the beams above the hearth. Drink an entire mug without using your hands. Recite a monk's blessing backwards while hopping on one leg. All performed in front of an audience who will remember your failure forever and forget your success before the next round. These are not games for entertainment. They are trials. Tests of character, stupidity, or how badly you want someone to like you. Participation is usually voluntary. Survival is not guaranteed. And then there's truth-telling, or what passes for it. A circle forms. A question is asked. You answer, or you suffer, either by drinking, bleeding, or revealing a secret that will haunt you into the next century. The questions are never kind. Who do you love? Who did you steal from? Why did you leave that village 2 summers ago? Some people laugh. Others leave the table and never come back. It's called bonding, or trauma, possibly both. Even the spectators are part of the game. They bet on outcomes. They cheer for pain. They pretend to be impartial until their cousin loses, and then it becomes personal. You are never just watching. You are recording, memorizing, preparing to tell this story badly and loudly to a stranger 3 towns over. The games blur into chaos. Someone plays a lute with 3 strings. Someone else juggles knives and prayers. A goat walks across the table. No one stops it. No one questions it. It's part of the game now. All of this, somehow, is tolerated, encouraged even, because games are safer than confessions, because betting on dice is easier than facing your life, because humiliation is cheaper than therapy, and because for a brief moment, someone is watching you, laughing with you, shouting your name as you do something profoundly regrettable. And, in the medieval tavern, being seen, being remembered, is its own kind of victory. The tavern keeper doesn't stop the games. They monitor them. Like a bored god watching mortals self-destruct for sport. They know when to intervene, when to let it play out, when to toss a bucket of water, or a mug of ale or a stool. They've seen this 100 times. They've played once. They no longer play. Children watch from corners. Old men place bets. Barmaids roll their eyes so hard it counts as participation. This is not fun. This is not leisure. This is medieval entertainment, where everything hurts, and someone always ends up shirtless, for reasons no one understands. And when it's all over, When the coins are gone, the stew is spilled, and the winner is puking outside into a decorative bucket. You nod, you clap, you say well played, and then you prepare for the next round. Because in the tavern, the game never really ends. It just resets. Louder, dumber, and somehow, with even more goats. No one sits by the fire in a medieval tavern for warmth. That would imply a functional fireplace, or insulation, or the idea that warmth is something peasants deserve. They sit by the fire because it is the stage. A cracked, smoke-belching spotlight around which muddy boots gather. Mugs are clutched like relics, and silence.brief, twitching silence, settles like dust before the next tale begins. Storytelling is not a hobby here. It is currency. It is entertainment, therapy, propaganda, and an elaborate method of establishing dominance without resorting to immediate physical violence. To speak around the fire is to demand attention in a room that only gives it reluctantly, and often while chewing loudly. But if you hold them, if you really hold them, you are briefly a king, a prophet, or at the very least, the loudest liar in the room. Everyone has a story. Not everyone has the nerve to tell it. Those who do lean in just enough to create drama, but not enough to catch fire. They begin not with a thesis, but a grunt, a pause, a suspiciously specific description of a werewolf's eyes. The audience shifts, cups are lowered, and for a few precious minutes, everyone pretends they're not covered in the same stew they've been eating for 3 weeks. The tales are not factual. No one demands proof. If you insist something really happened, it means you're boring. Good stories must be impossible to verify and too entertaining to dispute. The fisherman who fought a river ghost, the woman who wrestled a bandit and stole his accent, the monk who sneezed during mass and accidentally summoned a demon. All of these are probably lies. But tonight, they are more true than taxes. The storyteller's voice matters. Too quiet, and you lose the room. Too loud, and you seem desperate. You must glide through the chaos, your voice rising and falling like a dying bird with flair. You must embody the tale, even if you're just making it up as you go, especially if you're making it up as you go. Props are rare, but gestures are abundant. A mug becomes a sword. A spilled broth becomes evidence. A nearby goat becomes the villain. The tavern's very architecture joins the performance. The way the shadows flicker on the walls, the howling wind squeezing through the cracks, the occasional crashing sound from the kitchen, all of it becomes ambiance. The line between storyteller and audience is thin and flexible. Someone will interrupt. They always do. To question, to heckle, to suggest an alternate ending involving more goats. The storyteller must absorb these interruptions and convert them into fuel. The goal is not to finish the story. It is to outlast the hecklers. This is less literature, more combat. One does not win by completion. One wins by applause, by laughter, by the temporary silencing of other egos in the room. And when the story ends, when the final flourish is delivered, the last exaggerated death described, the final moral, awkwardly stapled on like a sheep's tail on a pig, there is a moment, a beat of stillness, a grunt of approval, a raised mug, or, if you failed, a fart and a new conversation about pig theft. That's the review. That's the critique. That's the system. Everyone remembers a good tale. Not in detail, of course. Details die faster than mayflies. But the shape of it, the vibe, the name, the fact that the fish had hands or the knight couldn't read, those stick around. They get retold, rewritten, corrupted, and weaponized. Your story, once shared, no longer belongs to you. It now belongs to the tavern. Congratulations. You are folklore. Sometimes the stories are communal. One begins, another adds, and soon half the tavern is contributing to the epic of how someone's uncle outwitted a tax collector by hiding inside a cow. These group efforts rarely make sense. They contradict themselves. They derail into singing. But they bond people, not through logic, but through absurdity, through shared breath, shared laughter, and the mutual understanding that no one here is right, And no one here cares. Children listen, even if they pretend not to. They memorize the rhythms, the cadences, the dramatic pauses. Someday, they'll retell the same stories with different lies. It's how culture survives in a world without books. Memory is fragile, but a story, repeated enough times in enough wrong ways, becomes immortal. Some stories are dark, very dark. Stories of hauntings, of curses, of the man who went into the woods and came back without his eyes. These are cautionary, but also comforting, because they give shape to fear. They make the unknowable into a plot, a narrative, a thing you can laugh at before shuffling off to sleep in a straw pile next to a guy named Wolf, who might be a murderer. The best storytellers are not the smartest. They are the most unhinged, the ones willing to become the tale, to stand on benches, to pour beer on their own heads, to shout until the walls complain. Their stories aren't remembered for structure, they're remembered for spectacle. For the moment, the room forgot its hunger, its blisters, its unpaid debts. For the moment, everyone laughed or gasped, or simply looked at the same thing at the same time. That's power, and that's the point. Because in a world this cold, this loud, this endlessly muddy, and profoundly unfair, the only real magic is making someone else feel something that isn't despair. That's what stories do. They don't fix anything. They don't heal the sick or fill the stew pot or stop the taxes. But for a few minutes, they distract you from the fact that your boots are wet, your ale is mostly water, and someone just died in the next village because a goose got territorial. And sometimes, that's enough. So when the storyteller finally slumps back into their seat, half-winded and whole-proud, there's no standing ovation, just a grunt, a clink of mugs, a new story, half-formed, rising in another corner. Because the fire is still crackling, the mugs are still warm, and the night, like history, is very long, very loud, and very eager to be retold. Medieval flirting was not elegant. It did not involve roses, gentle whispers, or moonlight serenades, unless the moonlight was accompanied by livestock noises, and the serenade was a bard loudly rhyming love with shove. In reality, it was a complex system of glances, grunts, and dangerously misinterpreted gestures. Welcome to Romance, Tavern Edition, where bread is currency, bruises are foreplay, and bards are both the soundtrack and the witnesses to your inevitable humiliation. First, let's establish that the tavern was not the ideal place to begin a love story. It was loud, filthy, and smelled like warm failure. But it was also the only public indoor space where people of various classes, smells, and emotional damage congregated. And so, like moths to a dung fire, humans did what they've always done in uncertain, alcohol-fueled situations. They attempted to flirt. There were no dating manuals, no courtship rituals codified for the muddy middle class. Everything was improvised, and most of it went poorly. If you wanted to attract attention, you did not wear cologne. You wore your second cleanest tunic and hoped the rat bites didn't show. You didn't quote poetry. You offered bread. Not fresh bread, mind you, unless you were royalty, but bread that was less moldy than average. Bread was affection. Bread was effort. Bread said, "I stole this for you, possibly from your cousin." If bread wasn't available, stew worked. If stew wasn't available, you had to rely on conversation, which was the most dangerous choice of all. Medieval flirting often began with an insult. This was not cruelty. This was strategy. A woman might call a man pig-faced to see if he had a sense of humor. A man might accuse a woman of sorcery to see if she had teeth. It was a delicate dance of mockery, all designed to gauge wit, resilience, and whether or not the other person would stab you for real. The brave escalated from insults to physical signals, a light punch to the arm, a shove that might be playful or might be a prelude to litigation. If someone threw a piece of bread at you, it could mean they liked you. If they hit you with a mug, it could also mean they liked you. Context was everything. Reading the room was crucial. Misreading it was more common. Many a medieval courtship ended in blood, exile, or an awkward explanation to the tavern keeper about who started the fire. Music played a role. The bard was the reluctant wingman of the medieval world. He sang ballads, played the lute, and narrated romantic disasters in real time. If the bard changed his tune to something soft while you approached your intended, it was a signal. If he switched to a drinking song halfway through your confession, it was also a signal, usually that you should stop talking. Bards controlled the mood, the rhythm, and occasionally the rumor mill. If they liked you, they could make your romance sound epic. If they didn't, your awkward stammering became next week's punchline. You didn't flirt in private. You flirted under observation. Half the tavern watched. A quarter whispered. The rest placed bets. This was not love. This was performance. You wooed your target and the crowd at the same time. Failed to amuse, and you were a bore. Succeed too well, and you were a threat. The safest approach was to hover somewhere between tragic and mildly entertaining. Touch was dangerous but essential. Too much, and you were accused of impropriety. Too little, and you were mistaken for furniture. A hand on the shoulder, a shared sip from the same mug, a dramatic gesture that involved accidentally brushing fingers. These were bold moves. They could earn you a smile, a slap, or an unexpected engagement. Words were rarely romantic. Compliments sounded like accusations. You have strong hands might refer to your ability to churn butter or strangle geese. Either way, it was high praise. You smell like time was flirtation. You smell like nothing was an insult. You smell was conversation. Dancing was an option, but only if someone had recently tuned the fiddle and the floor was less muddy than usual. Medieval dance was not sensual. It was structured chaos, designed to keep people moving and discourage duels. If your hands touched, it was accidental. If your eyes met, it was fate. If you fell, it was comedy. If you fell together, it was marriage. Speaking of marriage, most tavern flirtations didn't end there. They ended in confusion, ghosting via haycart, or awkward encounters at the market 3 days later. But sometimes, they led to arrangements, promises, or even actual unions. These were rarely romantic. They were practical. You had bread, they had goats. Together, you could make loud, unhappy children. Passion, if it existed, was brief. Reality arrived swiftly in the form of taxes, boils, and bad teeth. But in that brief moment, that flicker of candlelight, that shared smile over a half-eaten root vegetable, there was connection. Brutal, clumsy, weirdly tender connection. And that was enough. Until someone spilled ale, accused someone else of cheating at dice, and the flirting turned into a brawl. That, too, was a kind of courtship. The kind with bruises, apologies, and a shared seat by the fire. Both of you explaining your version of events to a barmaid who has heard it all before. And she has, because this is the tavern. And everyone flirts, badly, loudly, and with just enough madness to make you believe it might, somehow, work. Every good night ends with a brawl. Not because violence is necessary, but because in the medieval tavern, it is inevitable. A slow-burning consequence of overcooked stew, underdeveloped coping mechanisms, and ale strong enough to dislodge common sense from the human skull. You don't plan the brawl plans you. It's already there in the background, pacing like a wolf, waiting for someone to say, "My goat is faster than yours," with the wrong inflection. The tavern is not a peaceful place. It is a pressure cooker of bad decisions and repressed grudges wrapped in splinters, fleas, and fermented disappointment. The early hours are merely foreplay. By night's end, someone is going through a table. The spark that lights the evening's firestorm is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it's a spilled drink. Sometimes it's a dice roll that landed too conveniently. Sometimes it's someone singing the same line of a song for the 7th time. And sometimes it's simply the fact that someone made eye contact longer than 3 seconds. That's not a gaze. That's a challenge. Welcome to conflict. The early stages of the tavern brawl are theatrical. There is shouting, grand gesturing, accusations that escalate faster than a tax audit. Everyone suddenly becomes a legal expert. Words like dishonor and witness are used with the enthusiasm of people who don't know what they mean. At this point, the brawl might still be avoided. A mug might be raised in peace. A song might redirect attention. The tavern keeper might threaten everyone with a ladle. But if that first shove happens, if one person pushes another just slightly harder than necessary, it's over. The tavern becomes an ecosystem of chaos. Chairs are the first casualties. Designed neither for comfort nor durability, they are the preferred weapons of the desperate. One swing, one crack, and they return to their natural state as firewood. Tables follow, not so much lifted as leaned upon until they give up. Drinks spill. Bread is trampled. Someone tries to protect the stew. No one protects the bard. Punches in the medieval tavern are not graceful. They are wide, looping, imprecise events designed to hurt feelings more than faces. Most land on shoulders, chests, or bystanders. The truly talented miss entirely and strike furniture, dogs, or ghosts. If you are not in the fight, you are still part of it. You dodge mugs. You shield your soup. You cheer for the person you bet on 5 minutes ago. And you move your feet constantly, because nothing attracts violence like standing still. The smell of a tavern fight is distinctive. Sweat, smoke, spilled ale, and the tragic aroma of someone's sock catching fire. It is the scent of regret in motion. Sounds include grunting, wood splintering, the scream of someone whose nickname is now One Tooth, and the repeated phrase, "Hold me back," which is medieval for, "I regret this," and would like an out. The brawl follows a pattern. Chaos, peak violence, sudden pause. This pause is important. It's the moment when someone, often bleeding slightly and holding half a bench, says something profound like, "What are we doing?" The room stares. There is breathing. Then someone throws a spoon, and it all begins again. Not all participants understand why they're fighting. Some just get swept into it, like leaves in a flood of stupidity. You're punched by a stranger. You punch back. It's rude not to. Others fight with purpose. Old grudges, family feuds, romantic failures disguised as arguments about ale prices. In the medieval world, emotional expression is discouraged. Except here. In the tavern, with an audience and alcohol, you finally tell that guy from last spring what you think about his hat, and his goat, and his mother, and her hat. Sometimes weapons appear. Not swords. Those are for people with money and sense. No, tavern weapons are improvised. Mugs, stools, ladles, a particularly heavy loaf of bread. One legendary fight was ended by a hurled turnip. No one talks about it. Everyone remembers it. Injuries range from splinters to lifelong nicknames. A limp, a black eye, a suspicious tooth lodged in your collar. These are badges of honor, or cautionary tales, or both. The tavern keeper eventually intervenes. They have methods. A bucket of water to the face, a thrown shoe, a threat involving pigs and exile. Their power lies not in strength, but in reputation. You do not fight the person who controls your credit and your access to stew. That's social suicide. And even chaos knows its limits. When the brawl ends, it ends fast, like a storm that spent itself. People sit down, wipe blood from their brows, retrieve hats from strange places. The mood shifts. Jokes are made. Apologies are mumbled. Someone sings, again, the same line, again. No one fights this time. The energy is gone. It's the post-brawl calm, the warm, aching quiet of people who just collectively proved they are still animals. A dog barks. A bench is repaired with string. A barmaid sweeps up teeth like it's just another Tuesday. Because it is. This is not tragedy. This is tradition. Every good night ends with a brawl. Because in the medieval tavern, fighting is not about hatred. It's about release. It's the only therapy they have. Talking is for monks. Crying is for poetry. Violence is communication. It says, I exist. I feel. I matter. at least to this broken chair. And when you've bruised your knuckles, your ego, and possibly your reputation, you limp back to your mug, take a long drink, and nod at the man you just tried to throttle. He nods back. That's closure. That's peace. Until next week, when the stew is too salty, when the bard sings too loud, when someone, somewhere, looks at someone else too long, the night will start again, with a drink, a song, a stare, and the inevitable conclusion, a brawl. Because that's how good nights end when history is drunk, cold, and badly lit. In a medieval tavern, lodging was not a separate service. It was the natural consequence of drinking too long, walking too far, or existing too close to collapse. You did not check in. You simply ceased standing. Sleep where you fall was not advice. It was policy. Official lodging spaces, if they existed at all, were few, foul, and often indistinguishable from the parts of the tavern where no one was currently vomiting. The idea of a bed was laughably optimistic. A real bed, in the medieval sense, belonged to the rich, the noble, or someone about to die and receive their last comfort. For everyone else, there was the floor, or a bench, or, if you were unlucky and popular, a pile of strangers. Floor space was a battlefield. The early sleeper got the driest corner. The latecomer got the space near the door, where cold wind, angry pigs, and drunkards with bladder control issues converged. The floor might be straw-covered. More likely, it was just floor. Cold, hard, sticky with unidentifiable liquids, and uneven in the way that implied historical damage and no plans for repair. If you were lucky, you could negotiate space on a bench. This required diplomacy, bribery, or being the last person conscious. A bench was narrow, splintered, and structurally compromised, but it raised you 6 inches above the floor, which in medieval standards was practically luxury. The tavern keeper did not provide linens. Blankets were personal items, and if you lost yours in a fight or a flood, you improvised. You might wrap yourself in a cloak, or a horse blanket, or a damp curtain borrowed from a window with no glass. In winter, the competition for warmth was brutal. People slept in clumps, a practice that was both practical and deeply awkward. Personal space was not a concept. You shared body heat, breath, lice, and dreams. If you snored, you were kicked. If you moved too much, you were cursed. If you had gas, you were ignored, because so did everyone else. Sleep was not peaceful. It was punctuated by the groans of joints, the wheezes of the elderly, the nocturnal ramblings of someone with a head injury, and the occasional fistfight over blanket coverage. You did not expect silence. You expected survival, and maybe 4 hours of unconsciousness. Privacy was a myth. If you needed to relieve yourself, you found a corner, went outside, or used the communal chamber pot, which was last emptied when someone tripped over it. Modesty was optional. Judging was not. The smells were layered: smoke, stew, ale, sweat, old blood, wet wool, feet, rats, despair. You breathed through your mouth until you remembered that didn't help. Then you just accepted it. Dreams were strange, not because of the mysticism, but because your brain was trying to make sense of snoring, farting, ghost stories, and the cold kiss of a dog licking your ear. You didn't rest. You paused. If you had money and questionable judgment, you could pay for a room upstairs. These rooms were not better. They were simply quieter, possibly smaller, often colder. The straw mattress might be newer, meaning the fleas were still enthusiastic. The chamber pot might not be full. The window might open, allowing for fresh air and the occasional owl invasion. But mostly, you were paying for the illusion of dignity. And it was an illusion, because even in a private room, the walls were thin. The noise seeped through. So did the smoke. So did the occasional scream from downstairs, or the rhythmic thudding of someone attempting to dance alone with a barrel. The rich had better options. They could rent an entire floor, demand clean sheets, and pay someone to watch them while they slept, lest their boots wander off during the night. But if you were rich, you weren't here. You were in a noble house, a monastery, or a castle, not in a building with more rats than windows. Travelers accepted all of this because the alternative was worse. Sleeping outside meant wolves, weather, and waking up frozen to a log. Sleeping in a barn meant cows, pitchforks, and farmhands with territorial issues. Sleeping at home meant being in the same place as your family, your debts, and your responsibilities. The tavern, for all its filth, was freedom. No one expected anything from you except unconsciousness and eventual departure. Waking up was a process. It involved peeling yourself off the floor, checking your pockets, counting your teeth, and locating your shoes, which were often in the possession of someone else, intentionally or otherwise. Breakfast was not served. It was scavenged. If you had leftover stew, you reheated it over someone else's fire. If not, you drank water. Bad idea. Or more ale. Also a bad idea. Then you left. Or you didn't. Some people lived in taverns, not officially. But when you had nowhere else to go, the tavern became your address. You swept a little. You drank whatever was spilled. You became furniture. And eventually, the tavern forgot you were a guest. You simply were. Some found love here. Most found lice. A few found God, but he didn't stay long. The point is not that tavern lodging was bad. The point is that it was the best option available to most people for most of history. You didn't need comfort. You needed a place to collapse where no one would step on your face. And even that wasn't guaranteed. So you slept where you fell, cloaked in your shame, your stew-stained tunic, and the soft snores of 10 other people who had also made poor decisions and would do so again tomorrow. And if you were lucky, very lucky, you dreamed of a bed, with sheets, with pillows, with space. Then you woke up, in a puddle, in a corner, in history. Welcome back. Morning in a medieval tavern arrives not like a sunrise, but like a debt collector. It does not knock. It does not ask permission. It simply appears, unapologetic and heavy with consequences. The tavern, which just hours ago was a noisy sanctuary of chaotic joy, now resembles the aftermath of a siege. The fire has long died down. The air is cold, stale, and thick with the scent of ash, sweat, and congealed regret. Sleeping bodies litter the floor in artistic configurations no one remembers creating. Someone is curled under a table using a boot as a pillow. Someone else is still clutching a tankard with a devotion that borders on religious. The lucky ones are not awake yet. The unlucky ones are. Waking in a medieval tavern is not sudden. It is a slow, shivering, deeply personal realization that you still exist and that this is, in fact, your life. Your head does not hurt. It protests. Every movement, every sound, every flicker of light is an act of war against your senses. Your mouth tastes like something died in it and tried to leave a note. Your eyes refuse to focus. Your limbs creak as if your bones have re-evaluated the concept of loyalty. And worst of all, you remember just enough to be uncomfortable. You remember singing. You remember dancing. You remember losing a bet involving a chicken and an insult that escalated quickly. You do not remember how you got under a bench, or whose blanket this is, or why someone drew a mustache on your face with what smells like mustard. But others remember, and this is where the gossip begins. Gossip, in the medieval tavern, is not a side activity. It is a primary function. It begins before anyone stands. It begins in groans, mumbled fragments, and accusatory glances. It spreads like smoke through the room, curling around bruised egos and shattered dignity. Someone starts laughing softly in the corner. That's all it takes. A name is mentioned, a phrase repeated. You should have seen his face when the pig. And now the story lives. Exaggerated, embellished, eternal. Stories from the night before are not accurate. They are entertaining. If you fell down once, you fell down 6 times. If you spilled a drink, you flooded the table. If you flirted with a merchant's daughter, you proposed marriage and tried to wrestle her father. Whether or not any of this happened is irrelevant. It has been spoken. Therefore, it is true. The hangover makes defending yourself impossible. Words come out slowly, with pauses for nausea and existential dread. By the time you've managed a coherent sentence, someone has added a subplot involving a duck. You surrender. You nod. You drink something that might be tea, or might be warm puddle water. The tavern keeper does not ask questions. They saw everything and will say nothing for a price. Their silence is not free. It is purchased through labor, loyalty, or the humiliating currency of last night's stew reheated and served without comment. The floor is swept. The tankards are collected. The bodies begin to stir. Morning breath is a shared affliction. No one is immune. Everyone pretends not to notice. You might be missing a shoe. You might be missing a coin pouch. You might be missing your dignity. All of these things can be replaced, except for the dignity, which was never really yours to begin with. Conversations are slow and limited to phrases like, "What happened?" "Who hit me?" and "Where's my goat?" Some people pretend nothing occurred. They smile too widely. They compliment the weather. They ask about trade routes. These people are the most suspicious of all. Others embrace the chaos. They recount the night with pride, reliving each embarrassing moment like a war hero describing a noble defeat. These people are also dangerous. They remember everything. They will tell everyone. They already have. The bard, if present, has been awake for hours. He has already written 2 new songs. One about a love triangle, involving a knight, a chamber pot, and a misunderstanding. He plays softly, not out of mercy, but to rehearse. By tonight, your shame will have rhythm and a chorus. If you're lucky, you leave early, you say your goodbyes, you make promises no one believes. You step outside, squinting at the sun, as if it personally betrayed you. The air smells different, fresher, colder, less like failure. If you're unlucky, you stay. You order the morning ale, pretending it will help. It won't, but it delays the inevitable. Someone will ask about your plans. Someone will bring up your family. Someone will mention last night again, and the cycle begins anew. Medieval hangovers are not cured. They are outlived. They last until the next problem arrives. A debt, a disease, a new tavern guest with opinions. The hangover is merely the opening act for another day of medieval life, in which survival is measured not by progress but by avoidance, avoiding questions, avoiding shame, avoiding whatever that is in the corner, moving on its own. Regret in the medieval tavern is not dramatic. It is dull, persistent, and deeply ordinary. Everyone has it. Everyone lives with it. Everyone tries to drink it away. And sometimes, in that bleary-eyed, smoke-choked moment between last night's disgrace and today's repetition, you laugh, because it's all so absurd. The drama, the dancing, the stew, the fact that you called someone a wizard because they juggled eggs, the fact that they might have been a wizard, you will never know, because you never asked. And now they're gone, and you're still here, sitting on a bench that smells like goat, listening to a bard hum, a melody that might be about you, nursing a headache that has outlasted 2 monarchs, and wondering, not for the first time, why you came here in the first place. The answer, as always, is because it was the only place open, and because, deep down, you knew every good night ends in a mess, every morning begins in worse, and in the medieval tavern, the only thing stronger than the ale is the collective ability to forget, forgive, and do it all again tomorrow. In medieval society, the tavern was not just a place to drink. It was the town's lungs, liver, and occasionally its spleen. It filtered gossip, processed emotion, and occasionally ruptured without warning. While castles got the glory and churches got the sanctimony, the tavern got the truth, or at least a poorly articulated, ale-soaked version of it. No other structure in a village could contain this much noise, odor, and humanity in such close proximity without burning down or spontaneously weeping. Taverns were the only buildings where a farmer, a mercenary, a runaway monk, and a pig could reasonably share a bench and a single bowl of regret-flavored stew. It was a democratic experiment centuries before the word meant anything practical. There were no invitations, no velvet ropes, no seating charts. You walked in, you paid, sometimes, and you participated. What you participated in was not always clear. It could be a conversation, a game, a song, a fight, a marriage proposal, a theological debate conducted entirely through grunting, or a conspiracy involving stolen turnips and 3 fake names. But you were part of it. That was the rule. The tavern was a stage, and like all good stages, it blurred the line between actor and audience. The moment you entered, you were observed, judged, mocked, included, and possibly immortalized in the bard's next half-accurate ballad. Everything mattered, and nothing mattered. You could be yourself or someone else. Both would be ridiculed equally. But for a brief window of flickering candlelight and warm rot, you were seen. Taverns mattered because they were the only indoor spaces where peasants could express opinions without immediate ecclesiastical consequences. You could complain about taxes. You could insult a neighboring village. You could suggest that the local baron had never once held a sword the right way up. You could do this with flair, with song, or with interpretive dance, depending on the ale count. If you said the same things outside, you were arrested. Inside the tavern, you were applauded. Or at least not punched. Much. Taverns were economic hubs. Deals were made here, most of them bad. Grain prices were discussed. Livestock exchanged. Services promised. Contracts written on the back of someone's hand, then forgotten by morning. You could hire a cart, a guide, or a mercenary, sometimes without realizing you'd done so. Entire marriages were arranged over stew, ale, and ambiguous nods. Disputes over these arrangements were also settled in the same room, often by yelling until someone cried or fell asleep. In a world without mass communication, the tavern was the press. News travelled by ale. Who died, who married, who owed what to whom, who fought whom over whose goat. If it didn't get mentioned in the tavern, it didn't happen. If it did, it might have happened twice. The news was rarely accurate, but always entertaining. In that way, it has not changed. More than just a hub, the tavern was a memory machine. Villages had no archives, no official records of daily life. The tavern remembered for them, through retellings, through songs, through scars and stains and the lingering smell of something that might have once been cabbage. A wedding might be forgotten, but the fight that happened at the after-party involving a mule and a lute was remembered for generations. People didn't come to taverns just to escape. They came to belong. The tavern offered community, however flawed. Here, your bad luck had an audience. Your jokes had a rhythm. Your tragedy had backup singers. It didn't matter if you had a title, a trade, or a purpose. If you had a coin or a convincing story about one, you had a seat. And sometimes that was enough to keep you from despair. The tavern was not pure. It was not noble. It was not safe. But it was honest. Brutally, loudly, drunkenly honest. It was a mirror held up to a society that didn't always want to look, but couldn't afford to look away, because everything passed through it. Joy, grief, birth, death, famine, festival, revolution. The tavern absorbed it all and served it back with a ladle and a grin. Even religion, for all its rules and rituals, could not match the tavern's reach. Priests could preach about salvation, but taverns dealt in the daily sacrament of survival, one cup at a time. You could confess your sins here, and someone would top off your mug. You could admit your fears, and someone would say, "Same." The tavern forgave you before you even asked. It judged you only by how well you could pay or perform or laugh at your own misfortune. And in an era where dignity was a luxury, laughter was sometimes the only protest that didn't get you hanged. Taverns mattered because they kept people human. When everything else in medieval life demanded obedience, silence, or suffering, the tavern demanded participation. It reminded you that you were still part of the chaos, not just crushed beneath it. You could be wrong, ridiculous, offensive, loud, smelly, and absurd, and still be welcomed back the next night, or at least tolerated, which, historically, is more realistic. In cities, taverns were the glue between neighborhoods. In villages, they were the only place with walls that weren't a church or a pigsty. Travelers judged a town by its tavern, and the tavern judged them right back. Some had reputations: the fighting duck, the sobbing turnip, the honest hangman, names that told you everything and nothing. Some were known for music, others for stew, others for the fact that no one who entered left quite the same. They weren't always safe, but they were always there, through wars, through plagues, through rains that rose and fell like ale prices. The tavern endured, not because it was sacred, but because it was necessary. When the town crier lost his voice, when the blacksmith lost his wife, when the miller lost his patience, the tavern was where they went, not to be fixed, but to be heard, to be seen, to be reminded that they still had a place, even if that place was next to someone who smelled like fermented goat and believed bread could talk. In the end, the tavern mattered because it was where stories began and where they returned, where the hero stumbled in before his quest and bragged afterward about things that probably didn't happen, where lovers met, where friends betrayed, where enemies drank from the same cup because the innkeeper only had one clean one. The heart of the town didn't beat in marble halls or sacred altars. It beat here, beneath smoke, darkened beams, in cracked mugs and broken benches, in laughter that refused to die, and in the unspoken agreement that no matter how bad things got, there would always be a place to sit, something to drink, and someone to blame in the morning. That's why taverns mattered. That's why they always will.